Picture this, a young apprentice standing in a massive shipyard, surrounded by the deafening sound of hammers on steel, the smell of burning metal filling the air, watching a vessel 10 stories high slowly taking shape. That apprentice had no idea that the lessons learned in those shipyards would forge the greatest maritime leaders of the next 100 years. What happened in those industrial cathedrals of steel and sweat didn't just build ships, it built an entire century of leadership that would command the world's oceans. And today, I'm going to reveal why the shipyard became the unlikely birthplace of maritime greatness. But before we dive into this incredible journey, if you're fascinated by maritime history and leadership like I am, smash that subscribe button and hit the like button right now. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Now let me take you back to a time when the world's great maritime powers understood something profound. The best ship captains, the most brilliant naval architects, and the most effective maritime administrators all shared one common origin. They had spent years in the shipyards, learning not from textbooks, but from the unforgiving reality of building massive vessels from the ground up. I want you to imagine walking into a shipyard in the early 1900s. The sheer scale of the operation would overwhelm your senses immediately. These weren't just construction sites, they were entire ecosystems of specialized knowledge, where thousands of skilled workers coordinated in a complex ballet of steel, fire, and precision. The air was thick with purpose, and every person there understood that their work would either save lives or cost them at sea. What made shipyards unique as leadership training grounds was their unforgiving nature. You couldn't fake competence in a shipyard. A poorly riveted hull plate would fail under pressure. A miscalculated stress point would crack under the weight of cargo. An improperly installed engine component would seize at the worst possible moment. The ocean doesn't care about excuses, and the shipyard taught this lesson before anyone ever left the dock. I've spent years studying the careers of the great maritime leaders of the 20th century, and I keep finding the same pattern. Whether they commanded merchant fleets, naval task forces, or built shipping empires, they almost all spent their formative years in shipyards. This wasn't coincidence, it was cause and effect. Consider what a young person learned during a typical day in a major shipyard. First, they learned scale. Modern observers often underestimate how psychologically important it was to work on something monumentally larger than yourself. When you spend your days building a structure that dwarfs buildings, that will carry hundreds of people and thousands of tons of cargo across the most hostile environment on Earth, you develop a different relationship with responsibility. You understand viscerally that details matter, that shortcuts kill, and that excellence isn't optional. Second, they learned systems thinking before anyone called it that. A ship isn't a collection of parts, it's an integrated system where everything affects everything else. The placement of ballast tanks affects stability, which affects cargo capacity, which affects profitability, which affects whether the shipping line survives. The strength of the keel affects the ship's ability to handle heavy seas, which affects routing decisions, which affects delivery times, which affects contracts and reputations. Shipyard workers learned to think in interconnected systems because they had no choice. Third, and perhaps most importantly, they learned that theoretical knowledge meant nothing without practical application. You could understand the mathematics of stress analysis perfectly, but if you couldn't translate that into proper rivet placement on a curved hull in driving rain, your knowledge was worthless. This integration of theory and practice created a distinctive type of leader, one who respected expertise but demanded results, who valued innovation but insisted on proven methods, who could conceptualize grand strategies but never forgot the practical details that made or broke their execution. I've read countless memoirs and biographies of maritime leaders, and they almost all describe their shipyard years with a special reverence. They talk about the masters who taught them, the mistakes that taught them humility, and the successes that taught them confidence. They describe learning to read plans, to assess quality, to manage teams, to solve unexpected problems, and to maintain standards under pressure. These weren't leadership courses. They were leadership laboratories where the experiments had real consequences. Now, let me tell you about one of the most brilliant aspects of shipyard culture, the apprenticeship system. This wasn't just a training program, it was a complete philosophy of leadership development that produced results modern business schools still can't replicate. When I entered the shipyards for the first time, following in the footsteps of my predecessors, I was assigned to a master shipwright named O'Brien. He'd been building ships for 40 years, and he had a reputation for being demanding, exacting, and absolutely intolerant of mediocrity. On my first day, he handed me a hammer and pointed at a stack of steel plates. "You'll spend the next month learning to drive rivets," he told me. "Not because rivets are the most important thing you'll ever do, but because if you can't master something simple, you'll never master anything complex." That philosophy permeated the entire apprenticeship system. You started at the bottom, doing the most basic tasks, and you didn't advance until you demonstrated mastery. But here's what made it brilliant. You were always working alongside people doing more advanced work. You saw the progression. You understood where your simple task fit into the larger project, and you learned by observation as much as by instruction. The hierarchy in a shipyard was crystal clear, but it wasn't arbitrary. A master shipwright had earned that title through decades of demonstrated excellence. A journeyman had proven competence across multiple specialties. An apprentice was learning, and everyone knew it. But, and this is crucial, the hierarchy was permeable based on merit. Excellence was recognized and rewarded. Innovation was encouraged, and everyone from the newest apprentice to the yard superintendent was subject to the same ultimate judge, the sea. I remember watching a heated discussion between a veteran plater and a young naval architect fresh from university. The architect had designed a new hull form that promised better efficiency, but the plater argued it couldn't be built with existing techniques. Rather than pulling rank, the architect listened. They experimented. They modified the design. The final result was better than either original vision because it combined theoretical innovation with practical wisdom. This culture of mutual respect across hierarchical lines created leaders who understood that authority without expertise is hollow, and expertise without authority is ineffective. The best maritime leaders of the century learned to command respect rather than demand it, to listen to people with hands-on knowledge, and to make decisions that balanced ideal outcomes with practical constraints. The apprenticeship system also created networks that lasted entire careers. The people you trained with became your trusted colleagues, your business partners, your allies in professional battles. When you needed someone to supervise a difficult repair in a distant port, you knew someone from your shipyard days who had the skills and integrity to do it right. When you needed honest advice about a vessel purchase, you could call someone who'd helped build similar ships and get an unvarnished assessment. These networks weren't just social, they were professional infrastructure that made the maritime industry more efficient and more reliable. A master who'd trained dozens of apprentices over the years had effectively created a quality control system that extended across multiple companies and countries. The standards they'd insisted on, the methods they'd taught, the integrity they'd demanded, all of this propagated through their students and became embedded in the industry. Here's something that outsiders often don't understand about maritime leadership. It's built on a foundation of deep, technical knowledge. You can't effectively command a ship, manage a shipping line, or design maritime policy without understanding the engineering principles that govern how vessels behave. The shipyards provided this technical education in the most effective way possible, by requiring people to actually build the systems they would later operate and manage. Let me give you a concrete example that shaped my own understanding. During my second year in the shipyards, I was part of a team installing a new type of marine engine. On paper, this engine was revolutionary, more efficient, more powerful, more reliable than anything previously available. But when we actually tried to install it, we discovered a problem. The engine's vibration characteristics at certain RPM ranges would resonate with the ship's hull structure in ways that could cause fatigue damage over time. The chief engineer could have just reinforced the mounting points and called it solved. Instead, he gathered the entire team, from apprentices like me to senior designers, and walked us through the physics of structural resonance, the mathematics of harmonic frequency, and the engineering principles of vibration dampening. Then he had us develop and test multiple solutions until we found one that addressed the root cause rather than just the symptoms. That experience taught me more about engineering than a semester of classes ever could, because I saw the principles in action, felt the vibrations in my hands, and participated in solving a real problem with real consequences. It also taught me that good engineering isn't about applying formulas. It's about understanding underlying principles deeply enough to apply them creatively to novel situations. The technical excellence demanded in shipyards created leaders who could evaluate claims skeptically, who could identify snake oil from genuine innovation, and who could make informed decisions about complex technical matters. When someone tried to sell them an improved design or a revolutionary new system, they had the knowledge to ask pointed questions and demand proof. I've seen this play out countless times throughout my career. A shipping company considering a new vessel design needs leadership that can evaluate whether the promised fuel efficiency is realistic or marketing hype. A port authority deciding on infrastructure investments needs leaders who understand the technical requirements of modern vessels. A navy planning its future fleet needs admirals who can assess whether new technologies are mature enough for deployment or still too risky. All of these decisions require technical judgment that can only come from deep, hands-on experience with how ships are actually built and how marine systems actually work. The shipyard experience provided this judgment in a way that no amount of classroom education could replicate. But the technical foundation wasn't just about engineering. It was about developing a systematic approach to problem-solving that applied to all aspects of maritime leadership. The scientific method wasn't something we learned about in theory, it was how we worked every day. Observe the problem carefully, form hypotheses about causes, test solutions systematically, learn from failures, iterate toward excellence. This methodology became second nature, and it made shipyard-trained leaders exceptionally effective at managing complex organizations, navigating industry changes, and leading their companies through crises. They approached business challenges the same way they approached engineering problems, with rigor, creativity, and an insistence on solutions that actually worked, rather than solutions that sounded good. Now, let me tell you about something that prepared maritime leaders for command better than any simulation or training program ever could, managing real crises on the construction floor with real consequences. Shipyards are inherently dangerous environments. You're working with heavy materials, extreme temperatures, dangerous machinery, and gravity. Accidents happen, equipment fails, weather creates problems, supply chains break down, and when something goes wrong, people's lives can depend on how quickly and effectively you respond. I'll never forget a cold morning in the shipyard when I heard the alarm that every worker dreads, the emergency signal indicating a serious accident. A crane had partially failed while lifting a massive engine component. The load was swinging uncontrolled, threatening to crash into the partially completed hull and potentially injure or kill multiple workers who were trapped in the structure below. The yard superintendent, a man named Morrison who'd started as a rivet boy 40 years earlier, immediately took command of the situation. His response was a masterclass in crisis management that I've drawn on countless times since. First, he ensured immediate safety, evacuating everyone from the danger zone through the safest routes. Second, he established clear communication, one person calling out the load's movement, one person coordinating the evacuation, one person coordinating the emergency response. Third, he assembled the expertise, getting the crane operator, the rigging specialist, and the structural engineer working together on a solution. Fourth, he executed the plan, carefully controlling the load's descent to a safe position despite the damaged equipment. What struck me then, and stays with me now, was Morrison's combination of decisive action and collaborative problem-solving. He didn't pretend to have all the answers, but he knew how to organize people and resources to find answers quickly. He didn't panic, but he didn't underestimate the danger either. He communicated clearly and constantly, ensuring everyone understood both the situation and their role in resolving it. The shipyard environment created hundreds of these smaller crises that served as training grounds for handling larger ones later. A supply delay threatened to halt production for an entire section of the yard. A quality control issue required deciding whether to scrap expensive components or find a way to salvage them. A sudden storm damaged partially completed work. A key worker fell ill at a critical moment. A design flaw was discovered late in construction, requiring extensive modifications. Each of these situations required the same fundamental skills: accurate assessment of the problem, calm evaluation of options, decisive action, despite uncertainty, effective communication to coordinate responses, and the courage to make tough calls when easy answers weren't available. These weren't theoretical exercises. They were real situations where time mattered, money mattered, and sometimes lives mattered. The leaders who emerged from shipyards carried this crisis management experience with them throughout their careers. When I later commanded vessels at sea, I drew constantly on those lessons. When I managed shipping operations during wartime, those shipyard experiences guided my decisions. When I led my company through financial difficulties, I applied the same methodologies I'd learned managing construction crises. There's something uniquely valuable about learning crisis management in an environment where you can see and touch the consequences of your decisions. In a shipyard, a bad decision doesn't just affect abstract financial metrics, it affects the ship taking shape before your eyes, the workers depending on your leadership, and ultimately the sailors who will trust their lives to the vessel you're building. That tangible connection between leadership decisions and real outcomes creates a kind of accountability that shapes character and builds judgment in ways that softer learning environments never can. One aspect of shipyard culture that often gets overlooked is how profoundly international it was. The great shipyards of the world weren't isolated facilities. They were nodes in a global network of maritime expertise, and working in them connected you to that network in powerful ways. During my years in the yards, I worked alongside people from dozens of countries. There were Scottish engineers famous for their engine work, Norwegian specialists in timber fitting, Italian welders known for their artistic precision, German designers pushing the boundaries of naval architecture, American innovators bringing new construction techniques, and Japanese craftsmen with an almost spiritual dedication to quality. This wasn't just diversity for its own sake, it was the maritime industry's way of pursuing excellence by drawing on the best expertise from everywhere. If you wanted to build the best ships in the world, you needed to learn from the best craftsmen in the world, regardless of where they came from. This international environment taught me lessons that proved invaluable throughout my career. First, I learned that excellence transcends language and culture. A perfectly executed weld speaks for itself. A brilliantly designed hull form needs no translation. Quality work is universally recognizable and universally respected. Second, I learned that different traditions often had different strengths, and combining them created something better than any single tradition alone. The British excelled at organizational systems and project management. The Germans brought theoretical rigor and engineering precision. The Americans contributed innovation and willingness to try new methods. The Japanese added attention to detail and long-term thinking. Working in an environment that synthesized all these approaches taught me to be a much more complete leader than if I'd learned from only one tradition. Third, I built a network of professional relationships that spanned the globe. When I later commanded vessels trading internationally, I knew people in shipyards and maritime companies in dozens of countries. When I needed expertise, I knew who to call. When I needed honest advice about conditions in a foreign port, I had trusted contacts who would tell me the truth. When I needed to verify a company's reputation or a vessel's condition, I could reach out to people who had first-hand knowledge. This global network wasn't just useful for business, it fundamentally shaped how I thought about the maritime industry. I came to understand that shipping is inherently international, that maritime excellence requires learning from the best, regardless of nationality, and that the sea connects all nations in ways that transcend political boundaries. Many of the greatest maritime leaders of the 20th century shared this international perspective, born in the shipyards. They understood that protectionism hurt maritime industries more than it helped, that international standards benefited everyone, and that cooperation on safety and technical matters served all nations' interests. This understanding shaped maritime policy, international agreements, and industry practices in ways that made global shipping more efficient and more safe. I've watched with concern as some modern trends move away from this international culture of shared excellence. When countries try to isolate their maritime industries, when protectionism replaces merit-based competition, when political considerations override technical judgment, we lose something valuable that the shipyard culture understood instinctively. The best maritime leaders of my generation learned in the shipyards that excellence is international, that we advance faster by sharing knowledge than by hoarding it, and that the sea is humanity's common heritage that demands our best collective efforts regardless of nationality. Now let me address something that puzzled me when I was younger. How did shipyard experience translate so effectively into command at sea? Building a ship and commanding one seem like quite different skills, yet the best captains almost invariably had substantial shipyard experience. Let me explain why this connection runs deeper than most people realize. When you've spent years building ships, you develop an intimate understanding of how they work. You don't just know that pumps circulate coolant through the engine. You've installed those pumps, aligned that piping, and troubleshot the problems that arise when it's not done correctly. You don't just know that hull stress concentrates at certain points. You've reinforced those points, seen what happens when they're inadequately designed, and understand the physics that makes them vulnerable. This deep knowledge completely changes how you command a vessel. When I first took command after my shipyard years, I found I could diagnose problems faster and more accurately than officers who'd spent more years at sea but lacked construction experience. When the engine room reported unusual vibrations, I didn't just note it in the log. I knew exactly which bearings to check, which alignments to verify, and what failure modes to watch for. More importantly, I understood the ship's capabilities and limitations at a fundamental level. I knew how much stress the hull could handle, not because I'd memorized specifications, but because I'd built similar hulls and understood the engineering principles governing their strength. I knew how the various systems interacted, not because I'd learned it from diagrams, but because I'd installed those systems and traced those connections with my own hands. This knowledge made me a better commander in countless ways. I could evaluate repair recommendations intelligently, rather than just accepting whatever the ship's engineers proposed. I could plan maintenance more effectively because I understood which systems were truly critical and which had redundancy. I could push the ship when necessary because I knew what safety margins existed and which ones were conservative versus absolute. But the transition from blueprints to bridge wasn't just about technical knowledge, it was about leadership philosophy. The shipyard taught me that everyone's contribution matters, that expertise exists at all levels of an organization, and that good leaders listen before deciding. These lessons shaped how I ran my vessels. I treated my crew the way good shipyard supervisors treated their workers, with respect for their expertise, high expectations for their performance, and genuine concern for their well-being. I maintained the same standards of excellence that governed shipyard work, where good enough was never acceptable when lives and valuable cargo were at stake. I fostered the same culture of continuous improvement, where everyone was expected to learn, grow, and find better ways of doing things. The shipyard also taught me how to build teams. Ship crews, like construction teams, require a careful mix of skills, experience levels, and personalities. You need veterans who can handle any situation and train younger sailors. You need specialists who excel in specific areas. You need versatile generalists who can adapt to various roles. You need people who maintain calm under pressure and others whose energy drives productivity. Assembling and managing these teams was much easier because I'd done similar work in the shipyards. Perhaps most valuably, the shipyard taught me how to make decisions under uncertainty. Construction projects rarely go exactly as planned. You encounter unexpected conditions, materials don't perform exactly as specified, weather interferes, people make mistakes. You learn to make the best decisions you can with imperfect information, adapt as new information emerges, and maintain progress toward your objectives despite setbacks. This decision-making ability proved crucial at sea. Weather changes unexpectedly. Mechanical systems fail at inopportune times. Political situations alter port conditions. Economic factors change routing decisions. The ability to assess situations quickly, make sound decisions with incomplete information, and adjust course as circumstances evolve, all learned in the shipyards, made me a more effective commander than officers who'd learned only through sea time. Now, I want to address something that concerns me: the declining connection between maritime leadership and shipyard experience in modern times. As I look at the current generation of maritime leaders, I see fewer who've spent significant time in construction, and I worry about what we're losing. Don't misunderstand. I'm not arguing that modern maritime education is worthless, or that people without shipyard experience can't be effective leaders. What I'm saying is that something valuable is being lost as we move toward more abstract, classroom-based approaches to developing maritime leaders. The principles that made shipyard training so effective remain valid. Leaders still need deep technical knowledge. They still need to understand systems thinking. They still need crisis management skills. They still need the ability to integrate theory with practice. They still need to build and lead teams. They still need to maintain standards under pressure. The question is how we develop these capabilities in an era when fewer people spend years in shipyards. I've thought about this extensively, and I believe we need to consciously preserve and adapt the shipyard model rather than abandon it entirely. First, we need to maintain the principle of hands-on experience as foundational to maritime leadership. Whether that's time in shipyards, extensive sea time before command, or intensive practical training programs, future leaders need substantial experience with the physical reality of ships and the sea. You cannot lead effectively in this industry from an entirely theoretical foundation. Second, we need to preserve the apprenticeship model's emphasis on learning from masters while working on real projects with real consequences. Simulation and classroom work have value, but they must supplement rather than replace learning from experienced practitioners while doing actual work that matters. Third, we need to maintain the shipyard's culture of excellence, where mediocrity is unacceptable and continuous improvement is expected. In an era of participation trophies and grade inflation, the maritime industry still needs to demand genuine mastery because the sea remains utterly intolerant of incompetence. Fourth, we need to preserve the international nature of maritime expertise. The sea connects the world, and maritime leadership must remain globally minded, drawing on the best practices and expertise from all nations rather than retreating into nationalism. Fifth, we need to maintain the integration of technical knowledge and leadership development. Maritime leaders must be technically grounded, not just good managers or administrators. They need to understand the ships they command and the systems they manage at a deep level. I've been encouraged to see some modern shipyards and maritime organizations creating programs that attempt to preserve these principles. Structured training programs that combine classroom theory with substantial hands-on work. Mentorship systems that pair experienced masters with younger professionals. International exchange programs that expose people to different maritime traditions. Standards-based advancement where you must demonstrate competence before moving forward. These efforts give me hope that the essential elements of shipyard-based leadership development can survive even as the industry changes. But it requires conscious effort and commitment from industry leaders who understand what we risk losing. And that brings me to you. Whether you're already in the maritime industry, considering entering it, or simply fascinated by maritime leadership and history, you're part of this ongoing conversation about how we develop the leaders who will shape the next century of maritime excellence. I've shared my story and my observations from decades in this industry, but I want to hear from you. What aspects of maritime leadership fascinate you? Do you agree that hands-on experience in construction is invaluable? Or do you think modern training methods can achieve the same results differently? Have you had experiences in shipyards, at sea, or in maritime businesses that shaped your understanding of leadership? The comment section below isn't just for casual reactions. It's an opportunity for genuine dialogue about something that matters. I read comments personally, and I often find insights and perspectives I hadn't considered. Some of my most valuable learning over the past few years has come from conversations with viewers who shared their own experiences and viewpoints. So here's what I want you to do. First, if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel. I promise to continue bringing you thoughtful analysis of maritime history, leadership, and industry developments, content that respects your intelligence and time. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss future videos. Second, leave a comment sharing your thoughts on this topic. Have you worked in shipyards? Have you commanded vessels? Have you observed maritime leaders in action? What do you think are the most important qualities for maritime leadership, and how should we develop them? I genuinely want to know your perspective. Third, share this video with others who care about maritime excellence. Whether they're in the industry, studying maritime subjects, or simply interested in how great leaders are developed, this conversation needs more voices. The more people thinking seriously about maritime leadership, the better our industry will be. The century of maritime leadership that began in the shipyards hasn't ended, it's evolving. The question is whether we'll preserve the principles that made shipyard training so effective while adapting to modern conditions, or whether we'll lose something valuable in our rush toward newer, seemingly more efficient approaches. I believe we can maintain the essence of what the shipyards taught while embracing beneficial innovations in maritime education and training. But it requires intentionality, commitment, and ongoing dialogue about what we value and why. Your engagement, your comments, your questions, your challenges to my assumptions contributes to that dialogue. Don't underestimate the value of thoughtful participation in these discussions. The maritime industry's future will be shaped by people who care enough to engage seriously with questions about how we develop leaders, maintain standards, and preserve excellence. Thank you for spending this time with me exploring how shipyards forged a century of maritime leadership. Thank you for engaging with these ideas seriously rather than just consuming content passively. And thank you in advance for joining the conversation in the comments below. I'll see you in the next video, where we'll continue exploring the fascinating intersection of maritime history, leadership, and the timeless challenges of commanding vessels in the world's most unforgiving environment. Until then, fair winds and following seas. Subscribe, like, comment, and share. Let's keep this conversation going. The sea demands our best, and developing leaders worthy of that challenge requires all of us thinking seriously about how we do it. Your voice matters in that discussion. I'll see you soon.